Will President Zelensky be walking into the lion's den here in Mar-a-Lago, or a room where he could, in fact, strike a peace deal?
Joe, thanks. It does seem that there has been substantial progress in negotiations between the United States and Ukraine, which is not surprising because Zelensky has said yes to 5 or 6 Trump proposals for ending the fighting, whereas Putin has rejected every single one of those. What's not clear is what the Russians are up to.
Well, that's been a big question all along. And as Mitch McConnell has said not that long ago, Putin's been playing President Trump since January. Do you see that being the case, or could he, in fact, be about to turn position on this as well?
We've seen Trump in the nearly 11 months, actually it is over 11 months now since he's returned to the White House, take periods where he's been very tough on Zelensky, and then periods when he's been moderately tough, only moderately tough on Putin. And since he put the sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil, which was sometime in middle of October, he began to put pressure on Zelensky, and that's continued. But Zelensky, while conceding some things, has also stood tough on others. And what seems to have happened in the last few days is Zelensky's agreement to perhaps hand over, not to the Russians, but to a demilitarized economic zone, areas in western Donbas which are strategically valuable, which the Russian army has been unable to take. But he's insisted, and this is new, and the U.S. seems to have agreed, that Russia must pull back equally from the areas that it controls in Donbas. And what Zelensky has insisted on, it seems that the U.S. has agreed, that there has to be serious military forces. So we're not talking about peacekeepers from the global south in that area to prevent future Russian aggression. And what Trump seems to have conceded on too, which Zelensky has long sought, are clear guarantees, security guarantees from the United States ratified by the Senate. And now, according to what's in the media, which we can't be certain is accurate, but if it is accurate, it's interesting, the U.S. side has seemed to agree. So we've seen some serious movement by both Ukraine and the United States in the past week or so. Again, what we have not seen is any indication of Moscow's willingness to compromise.
What you mentioned what could happen in the Donbas, and I realize that could take on a couple of different forms. Is a demilitarized zone off the table at this point?
Well, it seems that the demilitarized zone is very much on the table. But the Russians had insisted, and still have not changed its position. Ukraine gives to them territory the Russian army has been unable to take, and the Russians give nothing back in return in Donbas. What Zelensky has insisted, and apparently the United States has agreed, is if Ukrainian forces are moving back in western Donbas, the Russian forces have to move back at least a comparable amount, and as to keep that as a demilitarized territory. So that's a serious concession. And again, if the U.S. has agreed there have to be troops, serious troops, in that area, in that demilitarized zone, international troops, to prevent further Russian aggression, that would seem to be another element of compromise from Team Trump.
All right. So you sit down at Mar-a-Lago and talk peace. Does that mean that Vladimir Putin also needs to sit down with President Trump? Will they get back to this idea of meeting in Hungary?
Well, I don't know where they'll meet, but I assume if Zelensky and Trump are satisfied after their meeting, then there'll be some form of reach out to the Kremlin. Now, according to the media, Kirill Dmitriev, who's the Putin envoy, was in Florida this past week. And so he apparently has reported back on roughly the terms that have been reached between the U.S. and Ukraine. And the Russian reaction has been interesting. They haven't rejected it. They've praised Trump's efforts to achieve peace. They said they're willing to continue to negotiate. But things Putin said as recently as a week ago would not allow the sorts of ideas that Zelensky and Trump seem to be agreeing on to be accepted by the Kremlin. But again, we'll see. Putin has been meticulous about trying to avoid annoying Trump, albeit without conceding one little bit. At some point, he may not be able to do the two things together.
To what extent is President Zelensky trying to head off the constant communication between Steve Witkoff and Moscow, whether he's talking to Putin or his lieutenants? Is that why he needs to get to Florida right now?
Well, I think that the plan that was given to Zelensky by the Secretary of the Army Driscoll in the middle of November was far too favorable to the aggressor, to Putin, and reflecting, I think, Kremlin influence on parts of the Trump team. But that was corrected, within a few days when Rubio met with the Ukrainians in Geneva. Rubio and Witkoff met with the Ukrainians in Geneva. And since then, we've seen a back and forth of ideas. And we've seen Ukraine being willing to compromise, but not to make fatal mistakes, like simply giving Ukraine highly strategic land in western Donbas without security guarantees, without any requirements from the Kremlin to actually make peace. And again, the deal that has been emerging, again, we only have some of the details, we don't have enough, suggests that the United States has taken account of this. And this reflects, again, Ukraine's ability, Zelensky's ability to advocate for their positions and Team Trump's willingness to listen to them. And that's a good thing.
Really fascinating. What does China make of all of this? What is President Xi watching in Ukraine?
Well, Xi is watching intently American policy in this war. He doesn't want Russia to lose. And by lose, I mean Russia not being able to take effective political control of Ukraine, which is why Xi has provided significant support to Putin, albeit trying to avoid American red lines, like by sending weapon systems to Russia. But he wants he wants to see America allow Putin to win in Ukraine, because that would be a sign of great weakness, which Xi would, you might say, interpret as meaning he has a free hand to go after Taiwan.
We are spending some time with former ambassador to Ukraine and Uzbekistan, John Herbst, ahead of this meeting at Mar-a-Lago on Sunday between President Zelensky and Donald Trump. Trump said he would end this war on his first day, Ambassador. Is there a chance he ends it in his first year?
No. The only way this will end is if Putin understands the United States is determined, that Trump is determined to achieve his stated goal of a durable peace. Not a peace which enables Putin to come back from war of Ukraine in 6 months or 12 months or 36 months. But the only way to do that is to make it extremely painful for Putin to continue. Because for Putin to have effective political control of Ukraine, he has to take a great deal more of Ukrainian territory, including Kyiv and Dnipro and Odessa, which means a lot more fighting. The only way that Putin understands he cannot achieve those objectives is if Trump puts serious pressure on him in three forms. One, greater sanctions, more of what Trump did in October, meaning the sanctions on Lukoil and Rosneft, two major Russian oil firms. Two, major weapons supplies to Ukraine. Under Trump's view, it doesn't have to be paid for by the American taxpayer, but the Ukrainians and the Europeans will pay for it. Three, the United States should work with our European allies at making sure the $300 billion, roughly, of frozen Russian state assets in the international financial system go to Ukraine. One of the bad proposals that was presented to Zelensky in the middle of November, reflecting undue Russian influence, was that Ukraine would get $100 billion of those assets, and the U.S. and Russia would get the majority of those assets. That was not a good look. That suggested to Putin that the Trump team was not going to be tough.